as I was saying before the break, we've got Jake Burnyeat here. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Who's Managing Director of Communities for Renewables. Really going to talk about some of the things that have been touched on in some of the earlier conversations around some alternative models of ownership and community benefits around wind turbines. So I think I'll just hand over to Jake.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone see that?
We can.
Great. We can. So it's an honour to be here. A few years ago, I did jury service, which went on for over a week, and I found it a fascinating but completely exhausting process. So I've some idea of what you're going through. And jury service is obviously, it's one very specific thing you have to focus on. This is very wide-ranging. So I am founding director of a not-for-profit company called Communities for Renewables. We help communities to set up their own local energy enterprises and help them to develop their own community-owned renewable energy projects that to date has mostly been solar, but we've also worked on some wind projects too. And I set up Communities for Renewables, or CFR, back in 2012. Back then, the idea of community energy was very new, but the UK was beginning to make significant progress towards decarbonising its electricity generation, shifting from large-scale, centralised fossil fuel generation to smaller-scale, decentralised renewable energy generation. And whilst back then we'd started to make good progress in that technology transition, I was frustrated that we were largely missing the opportunity to make an associated transition in how our energy system is owned and where the economic benefits of our energy system goes. And something like £2,000 per head of population leaves any local economy on energy spend. And if we had a local energy economy, that £2,000 could be going round and round in the local economy as a positive economic multiplier. 9 years on, the UK continues to make very good progress in decarbonising its electricity generation. Something like 40% of our power comes from renewables now. There is interest in community energy right across the country. Most towns and cities have some sort of community energy enterprise trying to do something, but we've largely continued to miss the opportunity to decentralise ownership and economic benefit. So that's what we do. Our experience in the last 9 years, actually mostly in the last 5 years, we've helped to develop and finance community solar projects with a capital value of about £60 million. We look after 50 megawatts of community-owned solar generation across 7 different localities across England. And those solar farms are projected to generate something like £20 million of surplus income over their 30-year lifetimes to support net zero transition projects and other community schemes in their localities. And having not worked on any new community energy schemes since 2016, when the feed-in tariff and renewables obligation subsidy scheme ended, in the last 18 months, we have begun to work on new community energy schemes again. And as you may have heard from other speakers, whilst the subsidies are gone, the cost of building new wind and solar has come down so much that it can now work without a subsidy. And we're working on a bunch of new kind of large-scale community solar farms and very early stages on one quite significant scale community wind project in Devon, which is a very long-term project and kind of purely theoretical at the moment. So what does community ownership mean? An important starting point is community ownership is not so much about where the money comes from, it's about where it goes to, and it's about the legal structure of the ownership and how the project is governed. So this is a typical community energy setup. You've got a not-for-profit company, asset locked, either a community interest company or a cooperative that owns a wind farm or a solar farm. And that wind or solar farm, might have cost 10, 20, 50 million pounds to build. And the bulk of that money has actually come from a bank loan, just like mortgaging your house. And those loans are typically paid off over 15 or so years. The rest of the money would come from a community share or bond offer, crowdfunding, and to the extent that those investors are local, it's a local benefit because it keeps some of the financial returns in the local community. But normally we find actually the investment comes from around the country. But that crowd investment is mainly a means to an end of getting that wind or solar farm built so it can generate income and generate surplus income for the local community. And the key thing that makes the community wind or solar farm locally owned, community owned, is that it's owned by a not-for-profit company that's set up to serve the local community. It's governed by local directors. Local people may have a one member, one vote say in how the enterprise is run. And all the surplus income after operating costs and finance costs and building up sensible reserves goes into the local community to support the enterprise's community purpose. And just because it's community doesn't mean it's volunteer run. I run a company, it's a not-for-profit company, but we all get paid, and we work on a contractor basis to look after the community solar schemes that we manage. And if community energy is going to be a mainstream business model, it can't be dependent on volunteer resource. It can't be dependent on people putting their retirement into getting these projects up and run and looking after them. It has to be professionally run, just like any other large-scale charitable enterprise. So that's the theory. Here's a real story from the Isle of Lewis in Scotland. The wind farm is, I've got to get this right because my sister is a Gaelic speaker, is Burnyeat, and it's up on the north end of the Isle of Lewis, kind of a peninsula off Stornoway. It's a 3-turbine wind farm, 3 big turbines, 3 megawatts each, 9 megawatts in total, 125 or so meters high. And it was developed by the Point and Sandwick Development Trust. And if you're not familiar with these, development trusts are quite common in Scotland, and they often kind of work in parallel to the equivalent of the parish council to bring forward community projects in an area. And the Burnyeat wind farm was developed by Point and Sandwick Development Trust. It took them 10 years. Starting in 2005, it was finally built in 2015. A lot of challenges to overcome in getting a grid connection, planning consent, and dealing with various legal issues related to the land. But it was finally constructed in 2015. Cost 14.6 million to build. And interestingly, none of that money came from community investment. It came from a combination of government grants, loans from a government, Scottish Government Investment Fund, and £10.4 million from a mortgage type loan from Santander Bank. And those 3 wind turbines generate something like £900,000 per year of surplus income for the community after operating and finance costs. And once the Santander loan and other loans are paid off, that income will go up to about £2 million a year. And that money so far has been used to support a number of things. And some examples here: 360,000 has gone into a program to support people in Lewis who are dealing with fuel poverty and to make their homes more energy efficient. 345,000 has gone into a new forest to plant 100,000 trees. In 2020, they put all their income into the Lewis COVID Emergency Fund. They've helped to fund a new coastal footpath, and they're exploring hydrogen-powered ferries to get to the islands. It's got to be clear that CFR had no involvement in this project. I've picked it because I think it's a good example. There's some photos. On the top left, you can see the wind farms are visible from the town. They're not in the middle of nowhere, and so not that dissimilar to what might be possible in parts of Devon. So I want to come back to Devon and make a comparison between a commercial wind farm and a community wind farm. And I'm going to pick on Brook wind farm as the biggest wind farm in Devon, up near Barnstaple and Ilfracombe, and compare it to what a new community wind farm of a similar scale might look like. So Brook wind farm, it was built in 2011. You've probably seen it in the paper. There's been various controversies around visual impact and noise. It's 66 megawatts, 22 large turbines, and it's now owned by ESB Energy, who are basically an Irish electricity utility. It cost around 75 million to build, and it's a commercial wind farm. Back in the time when Phillibrook Wind Farm was built, it was normal for wind developers to make a contribution to a community fund. And actually, the Phillibrook Community Fund is quite large for a wind farm. I think a commercial wind farm now in the subsidy-free world wouldn't make such a contribution. And they donated £1 million up front to a community fund, and then they've committed to providing 100,000 a year of funding, and that goes into a local community interest company, Phillibrook CIC. And the wind farm should generate something like £4 million over 30 years. You can go on Phillibrook CIC's website. They've supported some brilliant projects, but it's a minor share of the wind farm's revenue. A new community wind farm of similar scale, turbines have got bigger, so we'd probably use less but larger turbines, 13 times 5 megawatt turbines, owned by a Devon community energy enterprise. It'll be governed by local directors and the local community on a one member, one vote basis. And the key difference in its operating model, it's still got to raise the capital from a combination of bank finance and community investment and probably various other sources. But instead of the community income being a kind of handout, a contribution, it is the key purpose of the wind farm. And from the outset, it would probably generate something like £3 million a year. And that £3 million would go up as the finance is paid down, and the wind farm could generate something like 170 million over 30 years. So why community wind? If Devon is going to generate a significant share of its energy needs from within its footprint, we need more wind turbines, and a lot more wind turbines. We can't do it all with solar, and we can't do it all with other technologies. Community ownership will maximise local economic benefits of that wind, and to some extent, it should help with community acceptance of that change. Although, if you are, if your house is 500 metres away from a new big wind farm, it being community owned is probably not going to make much difference whether you want it or not. If you're upset by it. Most importantly for me, though, is we've got all these things we've got to do that are hard and costly, and big wind could be a significant funder for the rest of the transition, generating significant amounts of money to reinvest in making our homes more energy efficient, reducing energy costs and creating green jobs, funding the rewilding and tree planting that's needed, and in future funding the projects which will protect our communities that will be at risk of the impacts of climate change. The Stornoway example, that's typical of any wind project. Actually, they all take a long time. They're all very expensive, and there's challenges with any wind farm. The particular challenges in Devon are space. We don't have, with the exception of Dartmoor and Exmoor, large areas of open landscape where you can put a wind farm miles away from people. Largely, the hilltops we have are surrounded by valleys where people live. The electricity grid in Devon, as you probably heard, is full, and it needs major investment to upgrade it to accommodate more wind energy. You heard from James about the National Planning Policy Framework, which is an effective moratorium on new wind, and that needs to change, and Devon itself doesn't have particularly favourable planning policy framework for wind even before that happened. And it's expensive to get a community wind farm of the scale of Phillibrook through the planning process. Would probably cost £1 to £2 million of risk investment, and if you don't get planning, that's money which is lost. So that's not money which a community can just conjure up. There needs to be some way of funding that. So as I said at the outset, it's the exception. Devon has 55 large wind turbines, so not a huge amount. Only one of those, and it's a very small one, is community owned, and that's the single 250 kilowatt turbine, that's South Brent. And across the country, still less than 0.5% of our renewable energy is community owned. So what do we need to do to make community energy the norm, not the exception? Well, it needs some radical policy. We need positive planning policies to support community wind, with a target for a percentage of new large-scale renewables to be community owned. We need to designate land areas for new wind turbines with priority for community ownership. And we need a significant revolving development fund 10 million or more to support the at-risk development costs to get new large-scale community wind and solar projects off the ground and to support the core funding for the community enterprises that would develop them. Community energy needs priority access to the electricity network, and the local or central government needs to underwrite the cost of that. And in the absence of a subsidy, we don't need to get paid more for the power, but we do need a guaranteed price for the power in line with long-term average market rates. And lastly, I just want to pose a question as something for you to think about, is if you think of when you look at the transition pathways for Devon, and I don't know well, I understand you have seen them, the number of wind turbines we need to achieve net zero are either going to have a very substantial impact on communities because they'll be close to communities, or they have to encroach into the areas of Devon that we've so far deemed sacrosanct for any development, including wind, and that's Dartmoor and Exmoor. And are we going to continue to exclude all of Dartmoor and Exmoor for renewable generation, or could parts of the national park be allocated for wind? And what's the cost? On the one hand, the national parks are there to create a wild space, to protect the landscape. Wind turbines would no doubt change the landscape, but they're not incompatible with rewilding. And we could have areas of Dartmoor and Exmoor that are where wind farms are enabled, and amongst the wind farms, we reforest, rewild, and they become still a space for biodiversity, actually more biodiversity, because most of Exmoor and Dartmoor are not very biodiverse, significant carbon sinks and significant sources of low carbon energy generation.